And I remember when I first gave my first talk on climate change. It was following the publication of the first international report on climate change that came out. I was working in Cornwall at the time, and I took a guided walk around the area I was managing, and we just tried to identify what would happen if the things that were being talked about in that report came to pass. So we talked about rising sea level and the implications on some of the defences, but also some of the buildings. We talked about landslips that were happening. We talked about trees dying. We talked about changing the grazing regime from a summer grazing regime to a winter grazing regime. Okay, more like a Mediterranean thing. Now that was in 1988. Okay, and every single one of those things has happened. Absolutely every single one. It's been quite remarkable. We tend to think, because our minds are focused on such narrow bands of time, we tend not to be able to reflect back and remember exactly what it was. But I just remember that one talk was a place where we actually went out and looked, and exactly what we predicted has happened. Now we can't put all of that, we can't say every single one of those things is because of climate change, but it's just very interesting that those things have happened. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these things, but not necessarily in that order, if I can say that. Okay. You all know about the impact of flooding, okay, better than anybody else. But that isn't actually translated into how policy works, and it's not translated into, if you like, the way that organisations interpret that. Because this is one of the very, very few bits of evidence on how flooding affects people. Okay, and you can, whoops, we go back. And you can see what it says. I'm going to read it out to you. This is about the impact of flooding on people's health. And I know, because I still get the phone calls, there are people who were flooded in 2007 who are still suffering the consequences of that flooding. Okay? But we don't have any evidence for things like the impact on people's education, their employment, their life chances, the impact on the economic, what I call community economic resilience of an area. Okay? All of, and many others. That, you know, we've got tons and tons of evidence on, if you like, the technical aspects of civil engineering stuff on flooding, but nothing, almost nothing, on how it affects people. Okay, and people's lives and their communities. Really serious gap. And if we look back, the equivalent to the environment, I was involved right in the 1990s with doing the very basic data on what has come to be called natural capital and the evidence base for natural flood risk management. Well, we're there. We're pre-1990 in terms of the impacts on people. Okay? So there's a huge, huge hill to climb very, very quickly. So I'm not going to talk any more about that, because actually what this is all about is actually about community leadership. This is the stuff we've been demonstrating today. And the important thing about this is it's the two words, community and leadership. We're not dependent upon organisations always taking the lead. What you've demonstrated here, and is being demonstrated through other projects, is that when communities do take that leadership, sometimes we get the partners coming in behind and supporting that and taking that forward. And I just want to rattle through a couple of examples just to show you some of the other stuff going on around the country. So top left, that's in Shipston in Warwickshire, 189 square kilometres of work being led by a community group, okay, of natural flood risk management work, okay, with support from the local authority, the Environment Agency, and so on. Next one down, Southampton, combination of tidal, sea level rise, fluvial, and surface water and groundwater. The community have pulled together a whole variety of stuff, ranging from putting out a communal flood defence, as you've got here, to property protection, to warning systems, bespoke local warning systems, and so on and so forth. They are leading the process. Wolverley, tree planting. It's great to get Environment Agency out on work days. This is one of the places I was out there about 2 weeks ago. No public money, entirely done from other sources. Okay, attenuation ponds, tree planting, lots of stuff with local highways, entirely led by the local group. Top left, Brompton in Yorkshire. We help them. All of these, I should say, these are all projects we're involved with, one way or another. And there are many more. Yes, sorting out the local culvert. Yes, sorting out desilting the back and front, but also working with local farmers to put in attenuation ponds. Next one down, West Sussex. Huge repair and management issues. 4 flood groups, 11 parishes are coming up. It's taken them 5 years to put together a scheme for managing 1 in 1,000 fall ditches across a 5-mile stretch. Okay, just going out to consultation at the moment. Really interesting about a different, it wouldn't apply here, but it might apply in Lancashire. Really interesting stuff, and led entirely by the local communities. Top left, can be done in inner city areas too. Okay, this is in Liverpool, St Helens actually. Very deprived area, really active engagement in managing the local watercourses, their own property level protection scheme, quite a lot of help from us and the local authority. Some of you will recognise Lynn Jones from Cumbria, a real force to be worked with. And she and her colleagues have been working for years now on a whole range of different interventions up and down the country. Their current one is about reservoir management, and they have been battling hard to actually get the management of the reservoir to reduce the flood risk so that they can better manage the flood risk on their area. Bottom one is in Staffordshire, Shropshire, Staffordshire Borders, Shifnal, and they're working with 9 developers. There's basically a Victorian building that should have never gone ahead, and so they're trying to work with the developers. They've got 9 developers working, tens of thousands of homes going in, so they're trying to work with those developers to go beyond just keeping the greenfield runoff rate on the site and trying to get them to reduce the overall impact. All entirely community-led. So this is about what you're doing here, and boy is it wonderful to watch. It's really, really fantastic, and we need to do a lot more of it, of course. But the really important bit is, it's people. It's actually not the water, it's people. Okay. A little bit about National Flood Forum. The bottom bit is important, or the top bit as well. So basically, we try to facilitate and support the stuff that goes on across the country. We have people like Sarah, put that back there, you can wave, who's working in Rochdale, and was referred to in the last talk. So we have a few of Sarahs across the country and doing individual projects, but we also then try and pull together stuff nationally and so on. And we do it not by telling people what to do, but by facilitating the process so that people can take control of the issues in their lives. And we do it 3 ways: managing flood risk and impacts, after flooding, support that 6 months to 2 years, and sometimes much longer after flooding, because that's the bit when all the support just goes away. Helping people to work in partnership, giving them the tools so that they can, and the knowledge and experience, which you've done here brilliantly, but it doesn't happen everywhere. And so we tend to act as the independent broker very often. And the previous picture where we had the Shifnal thing, they'd had 10 to 15 years of battling with the agencies. And what we were able to do was come in and broker a new deal, broker a new arrangement, and give people the skills that they needed to engage. And then we act as a voice. So probably the best example is working with Flood Re, the insurance system. We brokered a way between government and the insurance industry to bring that forward. It wouldn't have happened if we hadn't pushed and done that. So we've got 300 affiliated flood action groups, projects with 9 staff, a board of trustees, so it's all the boring bit. And it's about people, not about stuff. As people have said too often today, well, not too often, it's not about the hydraulic models, it's not about the kit, it's not about this or that technology against another technology. It is about the people at the end of the day. So we're trying and doing and pushing boundaries, and just to say some of the direction where we need to be thinking about. So the top left one, which you can't see the detail, it's about flood disadvantage. Can we turn the studies on flood disadvantage into practical tools? Yeah, well, yes, we can. We've taken the Joseph Rowntree report and said, how do we turn that into really focusing on not just where there are issues with disadvantaged people, but what those issues are. We've got evaluation projects. So for a flood group, how do you know that you've got the right things in place? So we've got some tools, we've been just currently developing some tools to actually help flood action groups to understand, have they got all the skills in place, have they got all the mechanisms in place, have they got the right governance arrangements and so on. Bottom one in the middle, leaky water butt project in Great Yarmouth. We can all do leaky water butts, but the trick is to say we've actually all got a role in this. It isn't just people at risk of flooding, it's actually people everywhere. So your role might be different to mine. So these leaky water butts are going in, they're going in now, with people who are at less risk of flooding. Okay, so that they can slow that flow down so that further down the street it attenuates the flow and people's risk is reduced. And so we've been trying different sales techniques, as it were. Do we pay people to do it? Do we sell it for the benefit of they've got an extra bit of water in their water butt? Or actually do they do it for helping their neighbour? And in the Great Yarmouth, it's helping your neighbour. It's quite interesting. Okay. There's a few others in there. One of the things I think we need to do is about changing our approach. So, for example, we use the language here, which says 5 million properties at risk, but we say there's 23 million properties at risk, are not at risk. Well, that's not true, actually, because 50% of the insurance claims from the 15-16 floods were from properties that were not identified as being at flood risk. In 2007, it was 80%. So the reality is this wording should be saying, actually, everybody's at some risk, but some people are at more risk. And because what people, potentially people will, oops, going back. So what people are looking at is saying, I'm bound to be in the 23 million bit. I don't need to take account. Okay? So we need to be thinking about the language that we use and the behaviours that flow from that. There's a recent report that came out a couple of weeks ago, the long-term investment scenarios 2019, and they're talking about saying, well, actually, we should be planning for a 4 degrees rise in temperature. We need to move away from planning for a 2 degrees to planning for 4 degrees. And that, as Wendy was saying, actually means we need to rethink how we approach what we do in places. So it means we've got to, the bit in yellow is saying, with higher climate change, raising defences becomes technically and socially challenging. It may force society to think differently about the balance of flood and coastal erosion risk management activities. And then below, under a plausible extreme climate change scenario, there are more places where new investment is not cost effective. Under strict economic criteria alone, and not considering the social impacts, assets would be left to degrade. This would increase the risk. So the natural flood risk management stuff that we've been talking today, all of a sudden starts to take on much, much greater importance, okay? As in combination with all the traditional methods of working. I would say it needs to go a lot further than that as well, okay? In my list, I've got 28 types of intervention, of which traditional defences are 1, property protection is 1, natural flood risk management is 1, okay? So that leaves another 25 types of intervention. And it's the combination of those different ways of intervening in each place. In other words, what you do in Hebden Bridge is different to what you do in Mytholmroyd. The particular combinations. That's what we should be focusing on and actually maximising that in the long term. Okay. So there's a bit of work. These data, the sample's too small, etc., 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 but I think the chart says it, which is really interesting. So Fiona Mehring, who's doing a PhD on the work of flood communities, asks a very, very simple question, which is, should people be involved with their flood risk management? And you all say, yes, because you're here, but actually across the groups that she's looking at, she got a very, very high uptake. Okay? And what they're saying, she's saying through this, is communities need to be at the heart of partnership working. Okay, so and it's really important. The bits on the right are really, I think, are quite fundamental, which is saying engagement, partnership and leadership, communities should be able to play a leadership role. Okay? Which is what you're doing here. Okay? As in your workplace, people in communities have different skills and they don't lose them when they go home. Okay? When you go home from work, you don't suddenly become a blank slate with no knowledge, no skills, whatever, sit down and watch TV for the rest of the day, whatever it happens to be. We all have a range of, and we all have different skills, and that's important. And involvement doesn't mean being a volunteer just clearing ditches. It does mean galvanising communities, building partnerships, building innovation, developing things and driving things forward. Okay? But it requires partners to work with communities as equals. And that's one of the things that's really failing in a lot of places. Okay? Because the minute that you don't get that, people get discouraged, they get fobbed off, they feel disenfranchised. It must be participatory. Okay? And there must be no knowledge hierarchy. So one of the big turn-offs is when organisations say, actually withhold knowledge and keep it to themselves. So this requires some new ways of working, frankly, that we've got to see developing in the future. And it's where, in fact, we need the national strategy to be actually driving that as well. Okay? But it needs significant change, because I'd say in most places around the country, it's a significant problem. So when FCERM asked people, do you think that the flood authority show good leadership in terms of taking actions to reduce local flooding, we get a different answer from the graph 2 shots previously. It shows that there's a problem. Okay? And we have got to see some change. If we're going to work towards that 4 degrees change in temperatures, if we're going to bring in that range of 28 different types of interventions, if we're going to build a future that is adaptive for the future, if we're going to take that adaptive approach to managing our society, and if we're going to be reflecting the need for also new development and so on, we have got to be thinking about those new ways. But at the moment, another bit, if we look at the data on awareness of flood risk management, we can see that actually it's not moved, despite many millions of pounds being put into campaigns, despite many millions of, well, I don't know about millions, but lots of effort over many, many years on trying to get people involved, and a whole load of flooding. People are still largely unaware. And I'd say to a very big extent, that's because of the relationship between the state and society as a whole. We still have a situation where, on the one hand, people rely on the state to intervene. On the other hand, for most people, they don't think they're at flood risk necessarily themselves. They feel they're in that 23 million and prefer to keep it that way. And another way is actually saying it's actually psychologically, it's actually better for many people to be able to say, actually, it's better for my well-being to be able to bury some of that. So you see people who take the air brick covers off their air bricks when it's next to the front door, because they don't want to be reminded every day of the week when they're going through the front door that they are at flood risk, because that provides a stress on their lives day in, day out. And quite a logical response that is too. Okay? So we've got a really big challenge to work with. Oh, I don't know if, yeah. Right. So, the reason I'm picking this from the Netherlands is because a few years ago, well, many years ago, 1990, they introduced the Delta programme, a really big strategic approach to effectively equivalent to our flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. Okay? And they're talking about big areas, really big schemes. In this one which I visited, we are talking about a very, very large area, which is basically a huge attenuation pond. But the farms are being the farmhouses and the buildings are being lifted up, the roads are being put onto levees, so that they can function when the farmland is flooded. But that requires long-term thinking, decadal strategic approach, working with the communities on a relationship basis, not coming in and doing a project over 2 years and disappearing out again. It actually requires a different approach to the way that, if you like, the state engages with communities. And it's got to be about a long-term adaptive relationship, not about these one-off projects. And within that, I think we have to do several things, which Wendy will recognise. One, we need to be really ambitious. If we're talking about 4 degrees rise in temperatures, that means the level of our ambition has got to go up by, we're talking orders of magnitude here, right? It means that we need some long-term goals, as Wendy said. There are only 2 that I've ever dreamt up, and I'm hoping Wendy's got more because I think we need a few more. But the one, I'll just mention one, Flood Re comes to an end which is the reinsurance scheme, comes to an end in 2039, and it's in statute, it's already in law. And it's got a sunset clause in, and the requirement is that by then, people are able to get household insurance on the open market at affordable prices. Okay, that's a really good goal. So what have we got to do to meet it? Well, that means we've got to understand in Hebden Bridge, or the Mytholmroyd, or throughout the Calder Valley, as well as nationally, well, where are those properties? Because at the moment, you might know, but the data doesn't necessarily show it. We need to involve all organisations in society, whether it's a school, the local economic partnership, planners and developers, transport, infrastructure. We need to move our national strategy from being an Environment Agency corporate plan to being a cross-society plan. Okay? Wendy's heard this before. And we need that strategic coordination to take place so that the transport and planners and the providers of the highways management are all linked into a long-term vision. And it needs to be adaptive. So it needs to be looking ahead and saying, well, actually, we don't need this storage area now, but we are going to need it in the future, so we won't build there, for example. So we then need to say, for the future, what are the options for managing the future? And from that, come up with the plans. And then ask questions all the way along about how well are we doing. It's really simple project management stuff, but it needs to be applied at a really big scale. So if you like, this is what we've been talking to a lot of flood groups up and down the country. And that's the message they've been telling us back, and we've been feeding it into the national FCERM. And I'm just going to tell you about another exercise that we've been running with flood groups around the place. So Flood Re have been sponsoring us to run some workshops in England, Wales and Scotland. The Scottish Flood Forum are doing it in Scotland. We've been doing it in England and Wales. We've held 4 so far. The last one was in Lancaster a couple of weekends ago, and some of you were there, which is great. And what they've been coming up with is what are the key issues that people want to be addressed. And I've now been charged with capturing some of that and feeding it into you. Okay. So the key issues that people have been saying across the piece, and this is coming up, we've been hearing this for years, I have to say. Communities are just not being listened to. They feel ignored and frustrated with their knowledge and skills unrecognised. The scale of the issue is just not recognised, nor the scale of response needed. There are serious structural problems with policy. So we had a lot of talk today about SUDS and the policy issues around SUDS. Okay? Same with planning and so on. Nor the scale of serious structural problems with policies, organisations, roles and responsibilities. So there's huge confusion about roles and responsibilities for risk management authorities, for example. Now that either needs to be, the message needs to come out better, or the roles and responsibilities need to change. The need for accountability. So if we're going back to that big goal of what happens in Hebden Bridge, how do we know, and where is it transparent, and how are we going to hold people accountable? Because actually that's what you guys are going to want to drive forward stuff. You're at the head of the queue. You're the leading lights here in terms of actually making this stuff happen with natural flood risk management, but also other things. So how are you going to make sure that the people in the different organisations are actually progressing and delivering the sorts of things that you need to see change? So how do we do that? The interesting line, people have said, we want protection, not resilience. Interesting. And an explicit social contract between authorities and citizens, including having the right measures in place to support communities. And the one that keeps on coming back is enforcement of regulations. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's an interesting point. We should be looking at the long-term future and putting in place the things that keep us safe. And then the chart a bit I've shrunk, and it's in development. So the basic issue, I don't think, is the water, as I said before. I think it's actually about fear. It's actually about ending the fear of flooding. Because there are communities out there who live with flooding, and they know what to do, and they know they're safe, and so on. But it's actually, how do we get to a point where we can live with that water and feel comfortable and safe about bringing our families up with it? And that's, for me, about what resilience really means, so that we feel comfortable. So people need to be at the heart of flood risk management and actually driving that forward. Should live their lives without flooding dominating their lives. I meet so many people who never go on holiday, who, if they do go on holiday and it rains, they come back, who basically just totally transforms their lives. And we need to find ways of getting away from that. It needs to be about adapting to that future, that order of magnitude increase in ambition. Everyone and every organisation has an important role to play. And we need to build these strategies and plans and responses to make that happen. We need that social contract, and there needs to be greater clarity about where roles and responsibilities lie. I mean, one of the really sad things, I think, is if you actually look at the legislation and say, well, who has responsibility for flooding? Really, if you actually look at the legislation, it's just the property owner. Actually, everybody else has powers, but they don't have responsibilities. And that's a serious question as well. So on the back of that, we've been saying, well, actually, if we're going to be championing some of this stuff more, we are going to need to build more of a collective. Right at the beginning of this, I showed there were people and flood groups across the country who are doing things, who are doing really fantastic things. So actually, we need to bring those voices together. We need to build that for that case for change, to support the work that Wendy's doing and help drive it forward and make the case, but also to champion change in planning, to champion the change in SUDS, to change the way we work some of our other things in health and education in relation to flooding, to change land management practices, and so on and so forth. So we've just kicked it off, we've started up what we're calling a Friends of National Flood Forum. We've actually some of these things here. We are very keen for people to just sign up. It's absolutely free. But we want to get as many people signed up and pushing for change as possible. And I'd be really happy if people here were to take some of these away with them and feed them back to us as well. It's also available if you go on our website or click on our bulletin. There's an online version as well. But I'd be very keen and very happy to talk about that to people, anybody who wants to do that. Thank you very much.